Alright, hello. Today we're going to be taking a look at some interesting movements throughout the course of political philosophy, theory, and activism. The anarchist tradition specifically, I've talked a little bit about before. I have a 30-minute video earlier in the channel on just the history of the political philosophy of anarchism. Today we're just going to take a brief look at some movements, because one of the most common objections you'll hear if you tell people you're an anarchist, or you're even just considering it and talking about it online, you'll hear, oh, it would never work, or it never has worked. And these are just wrong statements, as is shown in books such as Noam Chomsky's On Anarchism. And this is also, I'm going to reference this a couple times probably, this is one of the better books ever penned on anarchism from what I hear. I've not read the whole thing, but it's regarded as one of the better pieces of anarchist literature. It's just on a history of the ideas and movements by George Woodcock. Good read so far. And then Noam Chomsky's book On Anarchism, he goes over some of the historical movements, specifically in like Europe, and then which is where most of them have happened. And then he talks about the philosophy as well. So that's a great book. But as far as the movements, we're just going to talk about a couple today. Don't have time to cover all of them, or even that many, because there's actually quite a lot. So that's why this statement that it's never worked is even further misinformed, because it's worked quite a few times. Again, I like to dispute when people say it worked there, what they mean. I'm also going to consider a couple objections. But let's just get right into these. Start off with a couple of like the weaker ones that could be easier objected to. Celtic Ireland from 650 to 1650. So for 1,000 years, Celtic Ireland was essentially stateless and operated where market services provided common services like courts, military, police. They're relatively isolated, so they don't have to worry as much about foreign invasion, to be fair. But the principles of self-organization and markets providing these services was and is generally a relatively anarchist principle. It could be objected to. They weren't entirely anarchist. They had like a tribe-like systems called tuaths, but these were organized mostly voluntarily, and you subscribed to the leader of a tuath as you saw fit, and kind of got to choose where what tribe you were part of, essentially. And then, as I said, the market provided all these services, so a good resource to look up on that. There's a couple online. Mises Institute does one. That's the one I remember reading, and there's a couple others. But that's a good one just for starters, that, statelessness and just voluntarily organizing into tribes and using free market services to provide these common necessities worked for about 1,000 years. And actually, for that time period, which is roughly medieval, they were quite a bit more advanced in some ways, from what I've heard, than like other parts of the world at that point. So the freedom there, that one could be objected to for a couple reasons, so I'm not going to die on that hill. I'm just saying, like, that's an example of generally anarchist principles: voluntarism, statelessness, free markets working for 1,000 years. Another one that is not entirely anarchist but exemplifies anarchist principles rather well is the American Wild West. What a lot of people don't know about the Wild West, there are some sources, again, I'll cite Mises Institute on this, and there are a couple others online, but I'd read the Mises article first. And that is that the American Wild West was largely stateless once people were just moving out west, so all their property transactions had to be done voluntarily between individual parties, because there wasn't the state or the government out there, the federal government, to completely settle all these land disputes. So there weren't as many people per capita, but like the crime rates were actually lower than some places in the East that were, more highly governed. So it was essentially stateless. They were still part of the American territory, so it's not completely anarchist by every definition. But just, again, the concept to get across here is anarchist principles at work: individualism, voluntary interaction. Again, they didn't have the federal government out there yet, so a lot of these people, at least not everywhere, so there were a lot of small organizations within the West where people, property transactions would be voluntary, and any interactions would be voluntary, really. So that's a good example too of just anarchist principles being applied. So those are two that it's like they wouldn't have strictly been self-identified as anarchist movements, but in a way they were, or at least they exemplified certain key anarchist principles. So now I'll get a little bit more. Again, I'll kind of breeze through these. I don't have time to go into all of them, but I can cite some sources. As I said, those 2 books are very good. And then Encyclopedia Britannica online, I'm getting a lot of this information from as well. I've read multiple sources on all this, but for just introduction to it. The Paris Commune is one Noam Chomsky cites. It didn't last long. It was more of an anarchist movement. What you see in Europe is a lot of anarchist movements. But yeah, the Commune of Paris, the Paris Commune, was an insurrection against the French government, and it didn't last all that long because the government stamped it out. Such as you see with a lot of these anarchist movements is they work, it's just the government stamps them out. So the Paris Commune didn't last long, so it wasn't like a super sustaining, long-going anarchist system, but it was an insurrection built on anarchist principles against the government, and it did, people did organize themselves without the state to fight the state and to just coexist, but it was, again, stamped out by the state because they don't want you to know that you can live without them. They need your tax dollars. Fun fact. And then the Free Territory of Ukraine is even a little bit of a better one because it lasted longer. It was an anarchist movement, again stamped out by the government, but this one lasted 3 years, stateless, with a population of, I believe, 7 million. That's from Wikipedia, so I'll fact check that, and if I'm wrong, I'll update it. But the population estimate is 7 million. It's not going to be exact from Wikipedia, but even if they're off by 6 million figure there, that's still 1 million people that organize themselves without a government. Anarchists. This one was explicitly anarchist. They explicitly were an anarchist movement. The Free Territory of Ukraine and Russia, it's a good one to look into. 3 years, millions of people, whatever figure it is exactly, that built this system on anarchist principles. Sure, it only lasted 3 years, but it didn't only last for 3 years, again, just because it imploded because the anarchist principles don't work. It was because the state externally tried to stamp it out again and did. So that's what a lot of people say, anarchism wouldn't work because it's like self-contradictory, the system will collapse on itself. It won't. Again, millions for 3 years. There's other ones I can cite too, I'll come back to that. But that's a general concern about pragmatism, is the principles themselves don't work, which isn't true. The best argument you can make is that the state will stamp it out. And that's not an argument against anarchism, that's an argument against the state and its tyranny. But to move on a little bit, there have been many anarchist movements. I mean, again, look up Britannica, they have a whole article just on anarchist movements. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is where I'm getting some of these following figures. There were Christian anarchist movements at the time of the Reformation, namely the Mennonites and the Quakers, that refused to recognize state authority and organized into some anarchist communes. There were some separatist communes in New England even, after the Pilgrims came across. Josiah Warren and some other transcendentalists organized some separatist anarchist communes in New England. Those are smaller examples, but again, smaller scaled examples, but again, anarchism. A lot of the rich history of anarchist movements is going to be found in like Europe. So there were multiple anarchist communes formed in Europe throughout the 19th century, because that was the time when a lot of the anarchist thinkers were writing, like Proudhon, Bakunin, and was also largely a response to the Industrial Revolution. So syndicalism, we see at work there, and a lot of left-wing communes. And then so Spain in the 1930s, also multiple anarchist communes formed. So yeah, that's a lot of it. There's, again, the Paris, the Free Territory. The Free Territory of Ukraine is probably my favorite. That or the Wild West, because the Wild West is a pretty great example, but it's not explicitly anarchist. The Free Territory of Ukraine is like, explicitly we are anarchist, stateless, and population estimated 7 million, lasted 3 years, self-sustaining. Anarchism works. The principles work. It's the state scared of it, so the state may stamp it out. So yeah, I'll just run back through those again. There's a lot here, so I didn't go into super detail on a lot of them. I just wanted to give an overview of, like, there are examples out there. So we have the Paris Commune, the Free Territory of Ukraine, Celtic Ireland, American Wild West as good examples of principles. Christian anarchism, the Reformation, Mennonites, Quakers, separatist communes and transcendentalist movements in the early Americas with Josiah Warren and other transcendentalist anarchist thinkers. Multiple anarchist communes formed in Europe throughout the 19th century, specifically Spain, the 1930s, France. That's really a lot of where the rich history is the early mid 19th century in Europe. You look into that, and there's a lot of anarchist movements. And so even when people say anarchism wouldn't work, it's like shouldn't have to point them to like, here's a continent that has not had a government for the last 2,000 years. Like, just the fact that multiple people worked together and formed these movements to push these ideas should be something, at least to people who are thinking about it. But then, of course, there were multiple communes that worked out, movements. There are even a couple, I'd have to look back into these, it's not really the scope of this video, but if you look into it, there are a couple small-scale anarchist communes even active in the world today. Again, mostly left-wing, like semi-communist, socialist market, which is fine if it's anarchist, communism and socialism, generally. So those are just some of the overview. A lot of movements, especially in Europe, a couple times where societies and territories have even been anarchist and worked. So anytime just somebody says anarchism doesn't work, or if you're watching this and you're one of those people, just know you're wrong, or the person telling you that is wrong. It has worked. It has happened throughout history. There have been anarchist movements that have been successful or semi-successful, at least for a while. The ideas that they've built on have worked. And a lot of times, again, as I said, it's the state that stamps these ideas out because they're afraid of them, not because they're inherently contradictory or not going to work. So again, I wanted to address some concerns about pragmatism. People say, again, it wouldn't work because it would implode. A lot of these examples help refute that, but also, along with that, people say it's just utopian. And a lot of people will say, yeah, I mean, it's not going to be realized in my lifetime, but it should at least be held as the political philosophy ideal to shoot for. So a lot of people don't realize that either. You can be have an anarchist political philosophy, but not necessarily be a activist for anarchism like immediately. Like, you don't have to hold anarchist principles and then go out and say like, we should have this happen now, because that may just be unrealistic. It's going to have to be gradual. Movements will have to work together, a lot of cooperation. So yeah, we couldn't just plunge the world into total statelessness worldwide right now. But that doesn't mean the ideal is incoherent or wrong. So it's an ideal to shoot for, if nothing else. But utopian speculation, as Stanford Encyclopedia even says, utopian speculation can be even useful for clarifying values. So yeah, even if anarchism is utopian, let's take that political philosophy and take the ideals we're aiming at a perfect society, and let's apply them now. So more liberty and liberalism in society, and advocated for correctly. So there are examples, and then Stanford also says there are examples of successful anarchist communities on a small local scale, for example, in the separatist communities discussed above. So these can be examples of experiments in our anarchist theory and practice, and the experiments largely have worked out of their own accord. So yeah, the utopian objection or just general pragmatism is not a good. I would say it's utopian. It's like, it has worked, and a lot of people would argue, and I think quite convincingly, that a state is more utopian. I mean, really, what's more utopian? The idea that people are going to be able to make decisions for themselves, or one person or two people are going to be able to make the right decision for thousands of people. Power always corrupts, so there's nothing more utopian than the idea of government. But that's a video for another day on why government is the worst. And largely more utopian than any form of anarchism I've heard of. There's always the objection you'll hear too, that anarchism will just evolve back into the state. When people make that objection, I don't get it. They're like, well, why are you an anarchist? You can evolve back into the state. I'm like, okay, so what's your problem? You're advocating for the state, or at least some form of the state, and you don't think anarchism will work because we'll just get back to a state, but you're fine with the state? It's completely incoherent. I guess they're like, it'll become a worse state. It's like, really? No. And then another anarchist objection to this is, for one thing, we don't know that. For one thing, also technological and theoretical advances in the world and education will hopefully prevent people from wanting to go back to this state system. People use like a Hobbesian objection that state of nature is just constantly warring. And then you can always object to that. You take the Rousseau's view that really it's more noble. But state of nature and anarchism aren't the same thing, because you can have technology and all that. Um, so the evolve back into the state objection. So one thing Stanford says is anarchists might argue that the disadvantages of state organization, the creation of hierarchies, monopolies, inequalities, and the like, simply outweigh the benefits of the straight state structure. So yeah, there was always that. It's like the just because anarchism may evolve back into the state doesn't mean we should give more power to the state to prevent that. I think it obviously be easier to prevent a tyrannical state from a position of liberty than it from a position of being crushed. I mean, you give the state too much power, and you're going to get to where some European countries are now, where you have guns and even knives taken away from you, and you have to have passes for this, passes for that, tax and everything. If you have a free society, it really is going to be able to sustain that liberty better than a at least mostly totalitarian state like we have now. So there's a couple, and then also you could just argue that, well, hopefully nobody would in the right mind would want to go back to the state, unless they were, of course, a dictator trying to rise, but nobody would want to be controlled once they've seen that freedom could work, so there will always be revolutions to prevent the state. So that's one route you could go to. There's a lot there. There's a lot of counters to these arguments, because they're normally like not extremely well thought out and not very historically literate. I'd again suggest reading Noam Chomsky, or if you think I should make some future videos on objections to anarchism, sure, I'd be happy to do it. I'm probably going to anyways. This is just kind of an introductory to that. Some examples of the history and some examples of arguments that are bad and I don't think really should be strong defeaters, at least of the political philosophy. Because the political philosophy and the political activism, as Stanford rightly points out, are in some cases different things. So just some stuff to consider, and yeah, thanks for listening.